on the shores of the Black Sea, and it is Monday, the morning after the weekend before. The biggest humiliation, probably, of Vladimir Putin's tenure in power, which has been going on for about 25 years at this point. He had to ring up Donald Trump, the US president, and plead with him to ask the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to allow Vladimir Putin to host his annual 9th of May victory parade in Moscow. How the mighty, in inverted commas, have fallen. So it is very clear at this point that the so-called strongman, Vladimir Putin, looks very weak and looks anything other than strong. So this is a nice way to sum up today's conversation. If you're new to this channel, this is my Inside Ukraine with me, Connor Klein. I'm here, as you can see, literally inside Ukraine. That is the Odessa Opera House right behind me. The sun is coming in and out of the clouds. Sometimes it'll get very sunny on me. Other times the clouds are going to cover it up. So you can see we're having a fantastic Monday afternoon in terms of it is now summer weather, even though I put back on the jacket just because the sun is out, and you can see there's some people walking around enjoying their Monday, not as crowded as it would be at the weekend. And prior to the May 9th weekend, at the last minute, Vladimir Zelensky passed in his basically the same as an executive order as president of Ukraine to permit the Russian Federation to host its annual Victory Day parade in Moscow with the exact coordinates of where they were allowed to hold it. And yeah, how the things have changed in 2022 and this extended invasion began. Moscow also hosted a very different May 9th parade with a lot of different armor there and a huge amount of jingoism on display. And what we saw from Vladimir Putin, I watched the parade and his speech was really a damp squib. It didn't rain on his parade, but there was no hardware. There were no tanks. They had some weird video with some CGI, AI, we can call it, animation from up in the air with the planes. It seemed like I guess there were actually planes flying very high above Moscow Red Square, but they were, because on one shot it looked like a real shot, and they were really high up in the air. The rest of the time they had like AI. It's kind of pathetic, the whole thing, and not very well mixed together. No tanks, as I said, no hardware what to speak of. The highlight was a group of North Korean soldiers marching in step on Red Square. That is what Putin has been reduced to. We don't know where that hardware is. Is it just that he was too scared to put it there in case the Ukrainians decide to blow it up, in spite of Zelensky having passed this law in Ukraine to allow them to have the parade exactly on Red Square, where he said they wouldn't strike them, or they simply don't want to pull stuff from the front lines, or they need it that badly that they don't want to delay getting to the front for his parade. And there were a few foreign dignitaries in attendance. There was the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, and the Kazakhstani president also was there, which hadn't been announced beforehand, but I guess once Zelensky passed the law, he felt it was safe to go to Red Square. Uh, Kazakhstan has an interesting foreign policy at the moment in the sense that they are still, guess to a certain extent, playing ball with Russia, but they are reducing their dependence on Russia over the medium term, which leads one to believe that they want to have this balancing act and make sure that they are further and further away from Russia and a little bit closer probably to China and the European Union and the US. It's kind of always been called the trifecta or trivector approach. No, I think it's actually quadrivector because the EU and the US is kind of becoming less of a consolidated collective West. So what does this indicate to us? Well, what I opined when I had a live stream on the day itself, and also yesterday on the other channel on my longer Sunday show, This is the beginning of the end of Vladimir Putin's reign in Russia and this phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war right now. And actually, I don't think there's been since at least Friday in air alert here in Odessa. There have been violations of ceasefire and attacks in other parts of the front and in other parts of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, but it is nowhere near as intense as it was last week, which probably means that maybe today or tomorrow they're going to start blowing lots of stuff up again with the missiles they didn't fire for the last few days. But that's another topic. What we see is Vladimir Putin is extremely weak. And as I alluded to, you cannot be a strong man if you're going to be a weak man. He needed permission to hold his very unimpressive parade. And if you stack that up with the state of the Russian economy, as I said in this channel and on the other channel, over 2 years, second half of 2025, there were going to be a lot of trouble for manpower, money, so the economy and materiel. And you don't see that many armored vehicles in the last year being used in the front by Russia. So that's the materiel part. They've come up with different tactics. Manpower, they're losing more soldiers than they are recruiting. So either they go for another mobilization like they had in the autumn of 2022, or they're eventually just not going to have enough soldiers anymore. And the money, the economy is in a recession. They may deny it by saying that technically they're making, they have this, we have a prediction of a 0.5%, and they're doing a lot of fudging a lot of numbers on the accounting to try and make look they're not in a recession. But the reaction in Moscow and St. Petersburg is clear that people see an enormous cost of living crisis. The rest of the economy has been crowded out by the war economy, and just a lot of businesses are in trouble. Russia cannot borrow money very cheaply on the banking market. So for loans. So the GDP per to debt ratio is not extreme, but that's more because they can't borrow them, which means that they have limited choices. They can lower the interest rate, and that will lead to pushing up the money supply and basically have just runaway inflation. That's one option I guess they can do. They can sell off their reserves in the meantime to plug, or they can have really stern austerity. But that's going to be difficult to maintain over the medium term if you want to remain popular as a strongman, because there is no light at the end of the tunnel. Donald Trump was elected. That was waiting for that was obviously a shrewd move by Vladimir Putin, because Donald Trump and his administration have cut off all aid, as JD Vance is so proud of, to Ukraine. They do sell weapons to Ukraine's European partners, and there is some intelligence sharing, but it's very limited. However, the European allies of Ukraine have increasingly stepped up to the plate to at least make up for part of the shortfall in the U.S. support. And Ukraine is expanding its domestic production. It's basically substituted artillery by having these drones. Now, most of the Russian soldiers' deaths are, I think it's like 80% are coming from drone attacks nowadays, and no longer from artillery. So they found a way to work around that. And if this goes on if this war were to go on for another couple of years, then presumably Ukraine will and Europeans will come up with solutions for the intel sharing and the weapons that they're buying from the US eventually. And that would be a way to neutralize the lack of US support. Putin has stuck to his guns, demanded a mid to long term capitulation by Ukraine, which is represented by the demand, which is backed by the White House, to for Ukraine to just abandon all of Donbass, give Vladimir Putin some sort of interim strategic win. You can say, okay, I liberated Donbass. That's what he can claim. At the moment, you can only claim you got a land bridge to Crimea, but they do have an actual physical bridge. Even today, it hasn't been completely blown up. So, what's the real strategic value of that, especially because since they destroyed so much and it cost them such amount of money, they definitely need some sort of political win in the sense of saying they liberated this territory and their own propaganda. But at the current rate of progress, it would take at least a decade for them to capture all of Donbass. It is now so slow. And we look at it, what it was in 2025, even with the 2025 rate of progress was a lot faster than what they managed this year so far. Then it would have taken them like best case scenario, basically 3 to 5 years to capture it. And do they have the money? Can they find the soldiers to keep going for another 3 to 5 years without mobilization? Doesn't look like. And now that it's even slowed down a lot further, it looks certain that they cannot achieve that kind of even interim strategic win. Ukraine is not going to withdraw from the Donbass. That seems clear. It's position of the government. So unless there's some sort of black swan event in Ukraine, then they will not lose this war. And there is now a recognition, it would seem, of that even in the Kremlin. Putin is increasingly unpopular amongst the elites in Russia. We see evidence of that in the sense that he has been clamping down the internet, restricting, trying to force people onto a state-run messaging app, or basically an all-encompassing app where they can eavesdrop, monitoring everything everyone can do. But there seems to be a lot of pushback from influencers and the general public about that. And that is not motivated by any sympathy or sense of empathy for Ukrainians that they've been trying to murder and rob for the last whatever is over 12 years. No, it's simply it's disrupting a lot of people's ability to make money. There's less money as the economy just floating around the economy in general, which means a lot of different clans are eyeing each other up to fight over the scraps, basically, that are going to be left as Russia goes into a more bleak economic situation. So he is in a very bad position. He does not have a clear sight to victory. Viktor Orban just lost the elections in Hungary. That means that the aid that Ukraine is waiting on from its European allies will be sent, and there isn't a replacement for him. Even though there are some other politicians who've been backing up Orban, like Robert Fico in Slovakia. He is basically done an about turn at this stage and is actually making some positive overtures to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. So he could, I guess, wait for changes in the bigger European allies, political changes, like maybe in the UK with Nigel Farage, if Keir Starmer has now an early election, which is a possibility after these elections, these local elections in the UK. It's not clear to me that even Nigel Farage or some other party that would be even more pro-Russian would come to power. And really, would Nigel Farage be in a position to actually help Russia? I doubt it. He may be just less willing to help the Ukrainians as prime minister, but would that really be a game changer? This point's not clear to me. And you still have a long way to go for new German elections if Merz stays on as chancellor for the full term. And you do have in 2027 the French elections. So I guess that could be his maybe plausible path to victory, is to wait for those countries to just hope that he can get political leaders or the political leaders there come to power that are going to be more hostile to Ukraine. But it seems there's been a bit of a political sea change even on the hard right, we'll call them, in the European Union. They are less openly, at least, sympathetic to Putin, less sympathetic to Donald Trump in the last 6 months. I think there was a watershed when the US threatened to invade Greenland, because then these European countries had to consider the possibility they might be in a kinetic war with the United States. Thankfully, that was avoided for now. And they certainly can't be depending on Donald Trump to protect them from possible Russian aggression, which may come most likely in the Baltic states if there is some sort of pause in fighting here in Ukraine. I mean, they could do it also while they're fighting here, but that would seem to be very improbable, considering they have to, obviously redeploy resources from what is increasingly a losing battle in Ukraine. So he doesn't really have an optimism, much reason to be optimistic about winning the war at this juncture. Of course, he can't now try to sue for some sort of cessation of hostilities and kick the can down the road 5, 10, 15 years, or maybe 5 months, and then rebuild the economy, the army, and learn from the lessons of this disaster of a train wreck of an invasion in 2022 and try and come back and conquer Ukraine another time, maybe in the 2030s, if the political landscape has changed a lot in the US and in the European Union. Maybe there are a lot more sympathetic parties to him there that wouldn't be willing to support Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine, in the meantime, he can work to undermine it politically, that it doesn't maintain its cutting edge defense industry and starts to fracture, maybe could plot to do that. But definitely winning with this invasion, it seems clear, and was also echoed by Volodymyr Zelensky this morning when he said that Putin wants to have negotiations for the first time. So it seems to have been this recognition. Here are all the signs we have that Vladimir Putin acknowledges that he can't win with this strategy of military conquest, at least not for now. Igor Girkin, who I've mentioned many times, who was a Russian ultranationalist, was in prison in Russia, not because he loves the West. He's actually was involved in the invasions of Ukraine in 2014, and so was invading Crimea and the Donbass. He has said last year, he said the chance of Russia winning with Putin in power are very slim, and it's more likely it's either going to be a full Ukrainian victory, either they take back all their territory and Russia basically capitulates in the war, or it will be some uneasy cessation of hostilities. And as I said, the can be kicked down the road for maybe a few years before, presumably, I mean, for he wants Russia to conquer Ukraine, so he would hope that they'll be able to rebuild and come back again, probably under different leadership. So he said in the last few weeks that now it doesn't matter if Putin even goes for mobilization. It's too late. He should have done it years ago. It might have made a difference in 2024. He thought, Not really, but 25, and by now in 2026, it's basically a waste of time." So if we look at it that this is also how Putin reads things, that means that it's probably he will not go for mobilization, which we've been kind of waiting for this summer, which could have extended on the war for, say, another 6, 12 months before they basically ran out of people they can probably train and conscript and get to the front lines before they would possibly even collapse at that point, because Russian society, especially St. Petersburg, Moscow, is not prepared without being paid a lot of money to go and fight on the front lines. So if this is a sign that he's less likely to take that option, then he basically has to go and speak to Zelensky about stopping the fighting. This is very, very dangerous for Vladimir Putin. Means it basically a recognition, and he can dress up any way he wants. And he could have got away with just dressing up a defeat in early 2022 as a victory if he just retreated back to the line of contact on 24th February 2022. If he'd done that after a month or two, it would have been fine. But now, after 4 years, the economy already being in such difficulty, and so many Russians having been killed or maimed or missing, and if we're having gone on for so long, and Russia's just become a worse place to live in for the vast majority of Russia, except for the few that I guess still make maybe some money out of there actually being a war compared to peacetime. Is he going to be able to hold on to power when that becomes clear? And that is a big known unknown, quote Donald Rumsfeld. And it looks like that's what he's starting to explore right now. Of course, he is Donald Trump, and via Stevie Witkoff, who's never come to Kiev and just hangs out in Moscow all the time, along with Kushner. And even I looked up yesterday, Marco Rubio has never, the U.S. Secretary of State has never come to Kiev in the last 15 months. That is how unhelpful they want to be to the Ukrainian position. Joe Biden came to Ukraine. Everyone could call him Sleepy Joe Biden, but apparently he didn't have a problem getting on a train from Poland and coming out to Ukraine when there was a war going on to show solidarity with the Ukrainian people. I mean, I'm not expecting Donald Trump to show up, but the fact that, and obviously not JD Vance, but even Marco Rubio hasn't come here. It's such a taboo. The only, what was the highest level official? I think it was Bassett, the Secretary of the Treasury, came to hand the Ukrainians basically a fait accompli of a neo-colonial mineral extraction deal where they're supposed to just sign over their minerals. I think that was just after the Oval Office debacle back in the day. I think that's the only reason he probably came as well. Just here you go, sign over all your, a large part of your country's wealth because we want it. That is how hostile the current White House is. He will still have them backing him to force Ukraine into some sort of terrible idea of a deal. It's not clear to me what Zelensky's plans are. There must be a recognition in Kiev amongst the government that they hold the cards. Russia and Vladimir Putin are in a world of trouble. The longer it goes on, the worse it gets worse quicker for Moscow than it does for Kiev, because they have to justify this imperial war of aggression all the time. And as the living standards drop, as they will as we go through the year, unless the oil price really rebounds like $250 a barrel or something crazy for a long period of time, Russia doesn't seem to have the capacity to be able to make a lot of money in the short term to fill the holes in its budget, and they can't borrow it in the short run. So they got to sell stuff off, as they already explained. So I would think that a wise negotiating strategy would just be basically to pay lip service, go along with it, so that Trump can't annoy the Ukrainians as much as he would otherwise and blame them, although he probably will anyways, judging by past performance, and then wait for things to get worse and worse for Russia and basically demand that they give bigger and bigger concessions, which I don't know if Vladimir Putin can really do that if he wants to stay in power. So they're gonna end up caught in the dilemma pretty quickly within 6 to 12 months. At which point he may go for massive escalation. That could be some attack in the Baltics to test Article 5 to try and get a strategic victory. I've said many times, I think that will fail, even if the US doesn't come, which I think is almost certain. I think deterrence is gone in the sense of the US responding to a Russian incursion, shall we say. We're not talking about tanks rolling towards Berlin, right? We're talking about Russia seizing the plausible deniability, maybe a town in Estonia or Latvia, and testing to see what the reaction is. I think the other European allies will come to the aid of whatever country is there, and they will successfully eject the Russian troops, regardless of what Donald Trump does. If he just does nothing, then I think they will be able to handle the situation well enough. I think they have enough, and I think Ukraine will aid them in doing that. There's already a lot of conversations between Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and the Ukrainian government about getting more anti-drone defense and getting more cooperation. I could even see Ukrainian troops being sent very quickly to the Baltics to actually physically eject those Russian troops and actually fight on EU soil in defense of those countries. I think that's a very likely scenario since they would have the most up to date tactics and understanding of Russian warfare. So it would seem like a no brainer for the Ukrainians to do that in exchange, obviously, for some help, further help from those countries, especially with joining the European Union, proving that maybe NATO needs to join Ukraine and not the other way around necessarily in 2026. So Putin doesn't have good options, especially because his main priority is to stay in power. He could end the war, but how is he going to sell it at this point? How is he going to stay on in power? He needs some sort of surrender from Ukraine, whether it's giving up Donbass or not to declare it a victory, because otherwise the ultranationalists just think, listen, you're a failure and we need to get rid of you. And so what is he going to do? He doesn't have good options. That's the bottom line. I think he's going to basically, judging what's happened the last few days, enter in some sort of negotiations, be maximalist, threaten a lot, committed probably more massacres here in Ukraine, threaten nuclear weapons, and then also maybe threaten the Baltics. Who knows what he's going to do? But it'll be a lot of threats as he comes to terms with the fact that he doesn't have good options. And from my point of view, the best strategy for the Ukrainians would just be to play him out, let his position get weaker and weaker, and just to increase their demands as Russia's negotiation position starts to weaken. And maybe we'll have a black swan event in between where they take out Vladimir Putin, and then we have a new government in Moscow that would be more amenable to ending the war and something that's going to be more acceptable to Ukraine. Because a bad scenario from Ukraine would be to just say, okay, we stop the fighting, but even if they don't give up Donbass. And what they now then have the situation where maybe Russia's obviously going to try and rebuild and come back, and they're going to be in this race basically to develop their own military and deterrence faster than Russia can. Russia could also, in the meantime, go attack the Baltic states. So, yeah, what Ukraine doesn't want is the opportunity for Russia to do what they were trying to do with the Minsk agreements, which was the first one they just violated because they thought they could take more territory, and then the second one, well, it never really got started because neither side was basically two sides were trying to get into a better position in interim, and Ukraine actually used that time better than the Russians did. So the Russians, when they attacked, they were not able to make that much progress like they had expected. They weren't able to take control of Kyiv, and now we have them in charge of, I think, about 19% of Ukrainian territory in 2026. It's less than it was in 2022. And if they continue on this path, even with a new strategy from Putin, if the Ukrainians just don't agree to what the Russians want to stop the fighting, then the position will get gradually worse for Russia. So, all in all, it's pretty good feeling here in Ukraine, in spite of everything. Well, I didn't have air alerts for a few days, so it's already a relief, although probably we'll get a lot of attacks in the coming week to compensate for that. But we can see here, for the first time since 2023 and the unsuccessful Ukrainian summer offensive, from a Ukrainian point of view, that the tide has turned quite definitively. And for now, things will be getting better and better from a Ukrainian point of view. They'll be in a stronger and stronger position. And yeah, if Russia and Ukraine don't stop the fighting, then at a certain point, I mean, Russia's basically almost stopped making any progress. We could see a scenario where Ukraine then has to consider going on the offensive, which would mean more losses for the Ukrainians, because normally the side on the offensive has more losses side on defensive. In general, of course, we saw with the 2022 Ukraine offensives that it was actually the other way around because the Russians basically got outflanked. But if it's not some sort of huge dramatic maneuver, which is possible, especially if there is an event in Russia that leads to a lack of will amongst the soldiers on the front line to fight. Could be something like we saw maybe another attempted mutiny, a coup attempt, could be a secession attempt, maybe in the Caucasus. You could see if Kadyrov were to die there and then see a succession battle. You see first a succession battle and then a secession battle with Moscow. Those would all be factors that could dramatically turn the tide in Ukraine's favor, allowing them to recapture lots of territory rather quickly without much loss. But again, that is something that, again, we can't foresee basically right at the moment how things will play out. Just that all in all, it looks increasingly rosy from the Ukrainian point of view compared to 2024 and 2025. Things are looking up. I did make the prediction that this year it would be 50-50, whether we'd see a temporary pause in the fighting. I'm not counting this weekend as temporary pause in the fighting because there's still fighting going on. Although it was getting closer to that, definitely compared to the other so-called pauses in the fighting. It was definitely respect. It seems to have been less intense over the last few days. But yeah, Vladimir Putin could go for that. So are we really at a 50-50? We're almost, we're 5 months in, maybe a little bit less, since I don't think it will be that quick a process unless something dramatic happens in Moscow in terms of his grip on power. And in 2027, my estimate at the start of the year is we're going to look at 80% likely we're going to have a temporary, at least a temporary pause in the fighting in 2027. I think, yeah, if he doesn't go for mobilization because he doesn't feel it's something he can do anymore, he doesn't have the popular support, then I don't see how he's going to be fighting by the end of 2027, unless his plot is just to get rid of all the potentially troublesome soldiers on the front line, just going to use them, let them get burnt up there. And then I don't know what his plan is to stop the Ukrainians advancing in that kind of scenario. But yeah, it looks very, very likely like 2027. So if you're considering coming here to Ukraine, come here to support its people in this obviously very extreme time of need. Summer season is going to start here at the end of the month, properly in Odessa. You have the beach clubs open in Arcadia down in that part of the city. And it actually opens up this weekend in Chisinau, the kind of summer season. And the weather, even though yesterday it rained, it was kind of very unseasonal. We'll be back to being warm, yeah, by the end of the month. So if you are coming here, is going to be a very interesting time. It could be the last summer actually with this phase of the war. So if you are coming, I have my guide down below. There, not only do you get the logistical and historical information and political background, you also get my favorite cafes, restaurants, clubs, bars, shisha lounges in cities like here in Odessa, Mama, up in the capital Kyiv, in Lviv, in Uzhhorod, and in Chernosy. Those are the five most popular cities away from the front lines, and you can go and invest in that down below. Let me go and look at your questions and comments. Reyes, how far can Ukraine go? Will occupied Donbass be recovered? How about Crimea? Good question. So, and I talked with this about my friends who also have a lot of contacts in the military here. They always call me the wow, you're optimistic. I've been more or less correct about most things during this war. So I was over optimistic about the summer offensive in 2023, but everything else I've basically been well ahead of the curve. And people talk about it's obvious afterwards when people call you a lunatic when you claim it at the time. So I see Ukraine more likely than not taking back all of Donbass. I think that will be also relatively easy to reintegrate into Ukraine for a very macabre reason, which is that Russia has had widespread mobilization in the occupied territories of Ukraine, including what they occupy in Donbass, which means there probably won't be very able-bodied men left there because Russia just basically is throwing them into the meat grinder. So they're the people who are most likely to resist reintegration. And I guess those who collaborated directly, they presumably won't stay. But even if they were, there won't be that big a number in a post-war scenario. So I think actually Donbass will be taken back, either militarily or through negotiation by Ukraine. The bigger issue is Crimea. Crimea is more difficult because it is easier for Russia to defend. It's a peninsula, has narrow ways of entry. So militarily, it would be a lot more difficult as an operation to take back. Of course, it can be isolated and negotiated back. I think it's a lot more likely if that were to be the outcome. It is more emotionally relevant to a Russian leader since it's a place where a lot of Russians have gone on holidays in the past, even right up until 2014. They could go there. I was there myself 4 or 5 times in in Crimea before the annexation. And then after the annexation, I went to this one tiny sliver that I count as being in the Crimean Peninsula. It was part of Kherson Oblast called the Arabatska Strelka, which I think it's called the Arabats Bits. Is that the name in English? And yeah, there it was under Ukrainian control. The Russians actually withdrawn after 2014. They'd actually come back down. It's like half of the spit was under Ukrainian control. So I think it's going to be a lot harder. Also, they have only started to mobilize Crimeans. So there's going to be a lot more Crimeans that are there. The male population is more intact than it is in the occupied Donbass. So they will possibly be more difficult to reintegrate if they were to harbor more pro-Russian sympathies, pro-Moscow sympathies, to be clear, because we don't know if Russian Federation will still exist with that name in the future for much longer. I would say probably within a decade, we'll probably have some sort of further decolonization of the Moscow Empire. Maybe that will be just more like Chechnya breakaway, maybe Dagestan or something, but it could be a lot bigger than that. So I think Crimea is going to be a lot harder to retake militarily. It could be negotiated. Russia doesn't pay a few hundred billion in what they owe in compensation, for example, or have to stand trial for the war crimes if they get back Crimea. That could be one scenario. So I think, either Gherkin said last year, it's basically most likely going to be either Ukraine does take everything, including Crimea, or we're going to have this pause in fighting. So I would say that considering he's already himself eliminated the another mobilization make much difference. We've got to say that's at least a 50-50. They take everything back at this point. If you look at it on the long term, not in the short term. Ray asks, who is Putin's likely successor? What type of guy was says to me? No one has any idea. Putin has been very astute at making sure that no one looks like a likely successor, because now you see why. Otherwise, if you're a failed strongman, this person takes over very quickly, or you got to eliminate them. So he's just basically eliminating anyone who looks like they might take over. So no one has any idea at the moment. It could be someone from the security services, Siloviki. They would probably have their chosen person. There's a lot of speculation. Could it be someone who's more further, extreme? Could be someone who actually pretends to be a liberal to try and restore things with Europe while they rebuild and get ready for the next war. So we have no idea. And Putin doesn't want anyone to look like a successor, because right now, when he looks weak, that's when people might pick back the successor. We saw Prigozhin when we had, probably Russia's only well-known military figure who's allowed to get into a power where he could actually launch a mutiny. And sort of Viking was removed. So yeah, basically, if you're loyal to Putin, you get to stay in your position, even if you're terrible at your job, which is good for Ukraine, because ultimately that will make it easier to defeat the Moscow Empire, the Russian Reich. Ray says, imagine the Russian population would want completely different type of leader. And no, they still want some sort of dictator. The vast majority of them, the most we still want Putin to stay in power. They just want the situation to change. So yeah, I wouldn't put any faith in the Russian people. Of course, there's a minority that wants something different for Russia, but yeah, they don't. A lot of them left, or they just basically remain stum for now. So I don't think the majority of Russians want a new leader. I don't think they want a new system. They want to continue as an imperial project. And like what happened in a lot of other European countries in the 20th century in particular, well, imperialism didn't work out too well, and they ended up with a lot of death and destruction, and they weren't able to maintain it. So they eventually gave up and became post-imperial. So at least in terms of how Russia perceives being imperial power, which is more like the 19th century imperialism, um, early 20th century. Ray says, looks wonderful there. Nice building behind you. 100% looks like Western European historical architecture, despite Ukraine supposedly being poor. This was built, I guess they were built around 200 years ago. Same architects as the Opera House in Vienna. A lot of this historical part of Odessa was built when it was incorporated into the Russian Empire, and it was built by Western Europeans. You have a lot of names along the city that are French, Spanish, Italian, German sounding, so either Austrian or German, Swiss. There's had a huge impact. People came from Western Europe to build it and also to populate it to a certain extent. So it has the center of Odessa is huge, huge Western European influence or Central European influence on its architecture and also the original people. Now, obviously, World War II meant a lot of people were killed. So the Jewish population was decimated, for example, and the Germans were expelled. I guess probably Austrians and Swiss were as well, to a large extent, since they were German speaking. And yeah, they brought people from other parts of the Soviet Union. So they repopulated to a certain extent. So there was a city here was an Ottoman fort called Haji Bey. When the Russians took control of it, they ethnic cleansed the region, kicked out the people who were living here, and then repopulated it with other people from their empire. And that's why it was always a lot of mixture of nationalities here in Odessa, because the previous population, I won't call them indigenous because they came and took it from people who were there before them as well, conquering at a certain point. But the people who were there before were expelled violently, and then they repopulated with a lot of different nationalities. There was even a very strong Italian minority here. There's a famous song called Solo Mio that most Italians believe was written in Naples, about Naples, but actually a Neapolitan author, he wrote it here because he lived in Odessa amongst the Italian community at the time. So that is one example. You have lots of French names instead. Longeron is the name of the street. Longeron is over this way, about 2 blocks. For example, you have de Ribas, Spanish name, which is one street over that way. He actually had an Irish mother as well. Then you have Bernardazzi, he lived in the region. And then I can't remember the guys who, you see, Buffo designed the Primorsky stairs or Potemkin stairs over there. So yeah, just had a huge influence overall. But then St. Petersburg also has a lot of European influence, Western European influence, because they wanted it to be a window to the West at the time. Um, Ray says he would expect Sony Putin's replacement to be a visionary looking for reconciliation with world and seven under Putin. For me, will be tough for me. Okay. Hope tends to be a hardliner, but not but only minorities. Yes, that is my analysis. So think, ask your questions and your comments, drop them there. I'll stay on for another few minutes. Um, yeah, it's a pleasant afternoon here in Odessa. I did a very long Sunday show yesterday on the Lifestyle channel, which you can check out on my other channel, about coming to this region this summer. A lot of advice for you, especially if you're thinking more long term, strategically, how to position yourself. In this channel, I deal more with the geopolitics and life on the ground here in Ukraine, since I'm inside Ukraine currently. And if you're new to this channel, my name is Connor Klein. I have a background in international relations, went to Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, worked as a lawyer, also in the EU institutions in the European Commission, and have been living in this region for on and off for over 10 years. I speak both Russian and increasingly Ukrainian, getting better and better, although it's taking a bit longer than I expected. This Russian propaganda myth that, oh, it's just a dialect of Russian. If only it were just a dialect of Russian, I would have learned the Ukrainian a lot quicker than taking a few years to be very blunt about it. If ever there was just a way to dispel the myth that they're dialects of each other. Ukrainian has more in common with Polish vocabulary wise than it does with Russian. So I think it's like only 60% in common with Russian. It's around 95% vocabulary in common with Belarusian, but no one says that there are dialects of the same language, which I find kind of amusing. Because there isn't a political reason to start arguing that. I guess if the Ukrainians wanted to invade Belarus, maybe they would claim that Belarusian is the Ukrainian dialect in that fantastical scenario. So, and I also speak Belarusian to almost the same extent as Ukrainian. I find it a little bit easier as a language. So, any last comments or questions? If not, I will wrap it up there. From Odessa in front of the Opera House. Ray said he got told off for mentioning Tolstoy by a Ukrainian girl. I had to show her that Tolstoy was anti-colonialist. Okay. Yeah, people from Ukraine probably aren't going to be in general very enthusiastic about hearing, but anyone who's born in the current territory of the Russian Federation, anyone supports Moscow. The bigger, more controversial figure is Pushkin. Pushkin was pro-genocide, never mind imperialism and conquest. And that was the Cherkessian genocide in what is now around Sochi, where they, but we don't know. I don't have a reliable number what percent of the population were either ethnic cleansed or murdered. But some estimates say 95%, like others say it was like 60. But it was a lot of them, and they still exist there in the Russian Federation, but they're just like a small minority nowadays. Interesting piece of trivia: Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister who came here, made the legendary walk down Hershadek around a month after the invasion began, showing that he has real cojones. He has I think it's great grandmother who was Circassian, who was actually expelled by Russia, like her family refugees in the Ottoman Empire, and she was actually sold as a bride then to a Turkish businessman, and then his son became a pretty well-known Ottoman diplomat who married an English woman, and then I think then their child is his grandfather. So we make a yeah, great grandmother is Circassian. Interesting. They are were famed for their beauty. They were considered a bit like all the marketing about the beautiful Ukrainians and Russian women nowadays. It was actually the Circassians apparently back in the 19th century. They were the ethnicity most famed for their beauty. But I haven't been to that region of the Russian Federation. Maybe if it becomes independent, I'll go there. And it'd be kind of weird all the same to go to a place which was part of the Russian Federation and spend years trying to destroy us. But yeah, we'll have to see how history plays out. And then I can tell you if there's any remnants of that famed beauty left. So, any final comments or questions? Otherwise, I'll wrap it up. I think Ray is the only person commenting at the moment. Once you hear, I will have regular content in the next week from here. As I said, I'm probably not going to do the Sunny Show. I want now the weather nice to show you what it's like. And also because the political atmosphere has changed following this debacle for Putin's military parade, I think we're going to see a lot of diplomatic movements in the next few weeks. Not saying that the war is this phase of the war is, if they just pause the fighting in the war, we'll basically take a hiatus like it did between 2014 and 2022, and we'll just have a version of Minsk 3, which is not going to be satisfactory for the long term for Ukraine and European security. But I think we are going to see in the short to medium term a lot of diplomatic movement, and in the medium term, we will see cessation of hostilities. I put it at 80% by the end of 2027. So, with that said, Dopabachina from Odessa, Ukraine standing tall, standing strong, and now officially granting permission to Vladimir Putin that he can hold his parade on the 9th of May. Maybe this will have been his last one. And Ray says, you mentioned Russian separatism. Hopefully that takes off sometime in the future. Here. Slava Ukraini, Rom Slava, do Перемоги, which I guess is slightly ironic to say after the damp squib that was Putin's embarrassing, not so victorious May 9th parade just past over the weekend. Ciao, ciao from Odessa.